All right, we have a lot to cover today, so let's get started right away. First, just a reminder on the schedule. This is the second to last lecture. We'll do in-camera image processing today, and then the last lecture is next Wednesday. Not next Monday, next Wednesday, June 1st. And we may need to finish up image processing. We'll do panoramas, panoramic stitching, and the last section on the history of photography, and that'll finish up the course. Okay, so let's start with some best photos for the night and color assignment. And so here is a night photo of architecture by Alice Liu, which Florian looked at and immediately identified the address, but I won't say it here. Very nice nighttime, or dusk, I guess, dusk shot. Here is Florian, night photo of nature. 16 8-second exposures, and there's, I guess, a little bit of fog. Made it very, very nice shot. Here is Gilbert King Fai Leung, sorry about the pronunciation, painting with light. So playing the piano. And it's very nice how the LED or whatever he's, bicycle light or whatever he's moving around is also the illumination for the piano. I think people had a lot of fun with the painting with light. This is a fun thing to try if you've never tried it. Here's Lauren Norrie in London doing the same thing while going down the slide. And here's Florian doing the same thing. So can anyone guess what this is? How did he make this?
Can I cheat if I read it?
What's that?
Can I cheat because I read it?
No, you can't cheat because you read it. Yeah. Oh, I guess that's right. A lot of people would have read the description. It's a pendulum with a light at the end, making a pattern. Back to London. There's Lauren at the barber shop or the hairdresser, doing color as a pictorial. Very, very nice. Very nice. That probably took quite a bit of work, actually, the masking to desaturate the rest of it. And here's a non-natural use of light by Florian, who has these two bottles sitting in his office over in Google Research. And under white light, it looks like this. And under blue light, it looks like that. So he's cheating a little bit here. There's a fluorescent dye in the one on the left. So it's not just a white balancing effect. There's a fluorescence effect as well. All right. Cheating is fine. It's all about the picture you get in the end, right? Okay. So today we're going to talk about post-processing pipeline. And so you've seen this slide already, and we're going to concentrate on the third box here. And we'll go through everything that's in that box. And so in particular, we pretty much already talked about demosaicing. Let me just throw up one slide again just to remind you. It's basically the interpolation of the colors in the Bayer mosaic to give you the green and the blue in the red pixel and so on that wasn't captured by the Bayer mosaic. So cameras typically, or sensors do, or image processing units do a lot more than just a linear interpolation. In particular, they'll typically try to avoid interpolating across feature boundaries. And that's, there are a variety of ways to do that by detecting edges and then not interpolating across the edges. There are lots of algorithms for doing this, and we're not going to go into the details for that. But you would like to do something more than just a simple linear interpolation. And in fact, it's often combined with other steps. Looking for edges would be better if it weren't a noisy image. So you might want to do a little bit of denoising, which we'll talk about later today, before you try to find those edges, before you try to not interpolate across those edges. So these algorithms can get complicated. All right, let's spend our time today on the rest of the pipeline. And we'll start with tone mapping. We've already talked about white balancing, but we didn't talk about tone mapping. So let's review the gamma story, because we talked about this several times already, and it comes up again here. So the goal of digital imaging is to accurately reproduce relative scene illuminances. So let's understand that precisely. We as humans are not sensitive to absolute illuminance. it's impossible to reproduce anyway, we are sensitive to relative illuminance. In other words, if I say this scene is 10 photons per second hitting a particular retinal cell versus 20 photons per second hitting a retinal cell, you'll see it got brighter. If it went from 110 to 120 photons, you might not notice the difference. We're sensitive to these ratios in photons, not to the absolute number of photons. So given that, well, I'll come back to that in just a second. So in some workflows, pixel value is made proportional to scene luminance. So a good example of that is computer graphics. It's typically a physical calculation, and that physical calculation is computing scene luminance. In other workflows, it is better to make it proportional to scene brightness. So I told you before that the cathode ray tubes had luminance proportional to voltage to some power, typically something like 2.5, and so television cameras were designed to invert that, to make the output voltage equal to scene luminance to 1 over gamma. So just to review that for a second, the CRTs did something like this with a power, an exponent that's greater than 1, and so the cameras wanted to do something like this in order that you would perceive on the screen something proportional to scene luminance. So pixel value proportional to luminance to 1 over 2.5, which is what that is roughly perceptually uniform. And so it's a good space for quantization. So let's ignore this curve for a second and just look at the one that the camera does. This is also a good space for quantization. Why? Because we are sensitive to the ratios of luminance. So what's the ratios of luminance? That's effectively a log curve, right? So a log curve doesn't look like this. It might look a little bit more like that, where changes in ratio here are equal changes on the y-axis, but a gamma curve with a gamma roughly 2.5 is kind of like a log curve. It's very similar to a log curve. And so if we quantize equally here after the gamma transform, we're going to do a pretty good job of being equally sensitive at each step to human perception. And so that is another argument for this being a good space in which to represent JPEG files, for example. Okay, so I've got a nice applet, and let me show you that applet. So let's first do the television system. So this is the National Television Standards television studio, and there is 0.5 on the camera, and there's the broadcast signal. There's no operating system in old television cameras, so I've just set that to Unity. And here's the output device, which is the 2.5 that I talked about before. Now, this isn't the same thing that I said before, because 1 over 2.5 is not 0.5. So this system will actually yield some residual gamma. That is deliberate. It's called a system gamma, and it was designed into the NTSC system in order to compensate for the fact that you're not viewing the original scene bright adapted in your eye. You're not outdoors looking at that fence. You're in a dark living room. And it turns out that in order to get the same percept, it's better to leave a little bit of darkening in there. That's called system gamma. So, all right, let's look at a camera. So there's Apple RGB. Oh, no, let's do sRGB. There's sRGB with a Macintosh running Leopard. You'll see why in a second. Old operating system. Raw file. Camera is 0.45. There's the JPEG file. So the output device, if it's a liquid crystal display, has a gamma of 1. So that correction for the camera has to be done in the operating system. But doesn't matter where you do it. These two both get applied, and you end up here. There's still a system gamma. This system gamma is more appropriate for bright offices. But it's still not exactly a reproduction of the original scene. Okay, fine. The problem with this one is that PCs didn't do this. And so there was this fight between whether you tuned your image on a Macintosh or a PC. The battle went on for years. PCs won. Macintosh bit the bullet, and they changed their system gamma. They called it the Great Darkening. And the reason they did is because if you look at that image while I switch to snow leopard, here, see it got darker? There's leopard, there's snow leopard. So everyone's pictures on a Macintosh suddenly got darker. But now it's 0.45, 2.2, system gamma 1, which isn't quite right for the bright office, but it's okay. It's not that bad. And so that's the way things work now. And the output device is still LCD. Okay. And so that'll be the same as, oh boy, Vista. Okay. Moving right along. All right, yep. Okay, so good, and it's a good space for quantization. It doesn't matter exactly what that gamma function is. It's still a much better space for quantization than raw luminance. Okay, so let's now talk about contrast correction or contrast adjustment. So there are lots of ways to do this. You can manually edit it. So you can bring an image into Photoshop, and let's say it looks like this. So there aren't many dark tones and there aren't many light tones. And a fairly typical thing to do is to apply an S-curve. So if you apply a curve like this, you're going to take many of the dark tones and make them darker, many of the light tones and make them lighter. And the effect might be something like this. Fairly typical contrast adjustment. And you can see in the histogram that the low contrast, where everything was bunched up in the middle, has been spread out more by applying that S-curve. You can apply another gamma transform in addition to the gamma that's used in going from RAW to JPEG. And so here's that additional gamma. Here's the original. Here is a gamma of 0.5 and a gamma of 2. So the way to think about that is just remember how how a power function works. If you have output equals input raised to some gamma, and then you want to make output 2 equals output 1 raised to some second gamma, that's of course equal to input raised to gamma 1, gamma 2. Okay? So you can easily concatenate those power functions. And you can see the effect that you get here. You can either slightly wash it out or slightly make it darker. I've done it rather exaggeratedly here just to show you. Okay. You can make local transformations as well. We'll talk about that a lot more in a moment when we talk about high dynamic range tone mapping, but the classic exemplar for local transformations is dodging and burning. So here's Ansel Adams in his darkroom, and he's showing dodging by holding up a little lollipop, I guess, and here it is diagrammatically. The print stays light in places where you block the enlarger. So this will actually stay white. The rest will get darker, the way printing works. Or here he's burning, which is sort of like a mask with a hole in it, and that will get darker there where the light from the enlarger hits it. So dodging and burning. Here's an example. This is one of his most famous pictures, Clearing Winter Storm, but this is the raw print. Here's what it looks like after dodging and burning. It's quite a bit of change. This is, I believe this is from his book 40 Pictures, examples of 40 images. It's quite a lot of difference. Okay. So what we've done so far, gamma transform, system gamma, dark adaptation. There's the example gamma and tone mapping methods. So Any questions so far? Now I'm going to talk about high dynamic range imaging and local tone mapping a lot more. Yeah?
We haven't talked at all about viewing flare compensation.
Flare compensation. Right.
In the actual viewing environment.
In the viewing environment.
You actually have two places. You have the capture and you have the viewing.
Okay. No, and I don't plan to talk about it, but it is an interesting topic. Right. So he mentioned flare. So first of all, there could be some haze or flare on the camera. So an S-curve is a good way to suppress that. And most camera processing systems will do some of that. And then you could also imagine being sensitive to the ambient display environment. So that's not so important when you're looking at a screen like this, but it's actually pretty important when you're taking one of these outdoors. And at a Photokina show that I went to a few years ago, Nokia had a great exhibit where they took one of their phones and put it under in a light box and then showed you an image on it, and then you could turn the lights on, which simulated being outdoors in the sun, and they would change the contrast significantly. And it looked pretty darn good. And I think Android phones should do that too. Not just get brighter, but actually change the tonal curve and maybe even the color rendition. I think a lot could be done with that. That's what you were talking about, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. And that's all. I don't have anything prepared on that. Okay. So let's see if there's anything on the dory. So high dynamic range imaging. Quiet. So we'll talk about capturing high dynamic range images. We'll talk about directly displaying them as high dynamic range images. And then we'll talk about the more common case of compressing the dynamic range for display on an 8-bit, as an 8-bit file or on a display with limited dynamic range. Okay, so I think I've already shown you something like this. That's not a clay baver, that's a Bayer with a clipped font there. I'll fix that later. So that's an ordinary Bayer mosaic, and on the right is the RGB clear. The problem with RGB clear is that those clear pixels, they don't have a color filter on them, so they're not absorbing photons, and so they saturate earlier. And so you need to use a shorter exposure if you want to avoid overexposure of the clear pixels. And so it's very much a compromise solution to do something like that, RGB clear or RGB white. Here's another technology that's been proposed, the idea of using per pixel neutral density filters. So neutral density means doesn't add any color to it. It's just gray. It blocks a certain fraction of photons across all wavelengths. And so what Sri Nair proposed is that you have a grid there of unblocked, partially blocked, fully blocked, or not fully, but densely blocked. And so each one of those will effectively have a different exposure. The problem is you are effectively trading spatial resolution for dynamic range because the features will not be well represented in a very dark pixel. And another disadvantage is that you are throwing away photons. You're actually absorbing them into those filters. Okay, here's another technology. You could use alternating pixel exposures. So there's several ways to do that. You could have rows of short exposure and rows of long exposure. You don't want to do that on every scan line because you've got this RGGB or something like that. You'd like to do some demosaicing in there. So it's typically a pair of lines that are short exposure and a pair of lines that are long exposure. This particular illustration that I grabbed seems also to be an RGBC pixel grid. So it's hard to avoid spatial artifacts when you're demosaicing because you've got to consider a larger neighborhood of pixels. When you're interpolating, you're looking for edges. Those edges kind of get confused by the long exposure, short exposure. And so it's hard to completely avoid combs or striping or some other kind of jaggy artifact. To break those up a little bit, some sensor manufacturers have gone to arranging the short and long exposures in zigzag patterns so that you don't see these horizontal striping artifacts. You may see other artifacts as a result, so it's not a perfect solution. Sensor manufacturers are still very much playing with these technologies. You can try alternating frames, so short, long exposure. And so this is this is a bit of a complicated diagram. This is time on the x-axis and y position scan line on the y-axis. And this says there's a short exposure, and then it begins reading out. So it's a rolling shutter, so it rolls down, reading out that short exposure, and then it exposes for a long time, and then reads out that long exposure. But meanwhile, it's doing not much of anything. So what they're showing in this slide is a technological advance Sony has come up with called overlapped readback, where they have a short exposure and a long exposure and then a short exposure jammed together, and they're reading them at, with a higher bandwidth readout. So they're reading them interleaved. But that's just a technological micro-optimization. The basic idea is you take 2 frames. So the problem with taking 2 frames is that, first of all, they might have different motion blur, and second of all, they might have different positions of moving objects, or the whole thing might move if the camera is shaking. And so you've got to do alignment. Here's another technology, non-destructive readout. The idea is, there are several ways to do that, but one is in this plot of time on the right axis, and let's see, that could be voltage on the left axis. For a bright light, it will reach saturation and you count the time to saturation. Or you sample very rapidly so that you know when it's saturated, one way or another. Whereas a low light will maybe never saturate. And counting time to saturation will allow you to look at, to know how many photons are coming from very bright objects that would otherwise saturate the pixel. The problem with this, so this was commercialized as the PixIm sensor. They're right here locally in Mountain View. The problem is for the low light, it's just acting like a normal pixel, so it has no better signal to noise ratio than ordinary sensors. So it isn't, for example, as good as taking multiple shots, which I'll talk about in a moment. Multiple sensors with beam splitters that have different exposures. Binning, where you average across multiple pixels in order to be able to be more sensitive to low light with only one readout for 4 pixels instead of one readout for each pixel. So the contribution by read noise is lower. But what is becoming one of the dominant ways of doing this is multiple exposure. So I've shown this slide before, multi-bracketed exposures. What Paul Tebevec has done is change the exposure time across a very wide range in the church setting in order to get even the skylight without blowing it out. So he changes the exposure time rather than the aperture, because changing the aperture will change the depth of field, whereas changing the exposure time doesn't. As long as it's a non-moving scene, it's the best thing to do. How about changing the ISO? It only affects the read noise, really. It isn't going to fix the problem with photon shot noise. So let's just make sure we understand what it means to take multiple exposures and how you combine these together. So in a very, very simplified way, if you think about, let's say we have exposure, we have one exposure that's a 1/30th of a second. And so it might be on a range from 0 to 255. And then we take another exposure that's a 1/60th of a second. So it initially comes in also 0 to 255. And then you scale up to be 0 to 511. And now you can directly average those two, because 100 photons at a 1/30th of a second would be like capturing half as many here. So once you double this, you can then just average those two. Actually, if you average them, you should probably weight this one more heavily if it didn't saturate, because it's got a better signal to noise ratio because it was a longer exposure. But if it's saturated, you don't want to include it at all. And so if you take both that weighting and that saturation threshold into consideration, it's a good way to combine multiple exposures. So in Paul Tebevec's paper, it's a slightly more sophisticated operation because he's considering the response curves of the sensor It's not just a doubling, but that's the basic idea. Okay. So that was done on a tripod in Paul Debevec's case. If you do it handheld, now there's a bit of a problem again. You capture the multiple exposures, you have to now align the images. And if this is a mobile device, you have to deal with both the camera shake and the object motion. And this is not a very massy device. And so there's going to be a fair amount of this handshake. So and then you combine the highlights from the short exposures basically and the shadows from the long exposures. I'll talk about merging methods in a moment. But it's hard to robustly handle both camera shake and object motion. And one reason is because the noise level will differ between the different exposure times. And so is this patch the same as this patch over here when one of them is much noisier, or is that a real texture that's in the scene? It may be hard to robustly decide. And a saturated area, of course, cannot be aligned at all. If part of it is a light source or part of it's the sky and the sky blew out, you don't know where you are in the other image. And so these techniques often lead to ghosts. Apple's HDR used to have lots of ghosts. They have less now. They're doing better. And it's probably because they're doing similar things to what we're doing, which are per tile alignments and some kind of robust fallback. It's a hard problem. So here's HDR Plus in the Google Camera app. What we do to ameliorate the problem of merging images that look different is that we take all of our images with the same exposure time. So same exposure on all images. That avoids blowing out the capture burst of underexposed images. The underexposure avoids blowing out highlights, and having them all be the same exposure means that alignment is much more robust. All the images look alike. And you would think, well, you can't do high dynamic range imaging that way. Well, you can. All you do is you down expose to avoid blowing out the highlights and then take lots and lots of images. And we know that the signal to noise ratio will improve as the square root of the number of pictures we take if we average them together. So we then align them, but alignment's easier because they all look the same. And by averaging them together, we will reduce the noise in the shadows. So now we have no blown out highlights, clean shadows, and we can now boost those shadows. And that's the tone mapping, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So it's a robust strategy for doing high dynamic range capture. And that's what the Google Camera app does in HDR Plus mode. That, by the way, has been on a public blog, and we've submitted a paper for publication that gives more details. So I talked about neutral density filters. So I don't know where to put that in this lecture, but it's just fun to just somewhere mention games you can play with neutral density filters and dynamic range. So you can go by, let me show the slide sequence first. So this was 1/500th of a second, f5.6, ISO 800, and then I started playing with the shutter speed. 1/25th, 30th, 1/8, half a second, 2 seconds, 8 seconds. So if I compare the left and the right, in order to have roughly the same exposure, in order not to be grossly overexposed, I have to adjust something else. And so here's what I did in this case. As I went from a 500th to 8 seconds, that was 12 f-stops, 12 doublings. So I compensated first by changing the f number. So there would have been a depth of field change, except there isn't that much depth of field looking down at a stream. So I got back 4 stops. I changed the ISO. I got back a few more stops. And then eventually I had to do something else. And so the standard thing to do is neutral density filters. So you can go buy these filters. Here is an ND8 filter. You can see it's pretty dark. So 8 is 3 f-stops. So 2 to the third is 8. Here's one that's even darker. It's 16, so that's 4 f-stops. You can screw them together and get something really dark. Oh. And so I got 5 stops using that. And so You have to compensate for changing the exposure time, but if you do, using neutral density filters, you can have all kinds of fun. We ought to be able to do this using computational photography, shouldn't we? Yeah. Let's work on that. You can turn water into silk. Okay, back to what we were doing. So let's talk about direct display of high dynamic range images. So here is a technology, Sunnybrook. They were bought by Dolby. And what they did was they had a high-res foreground image on an LCD and then some kind of backlight that was spatially variable. And so one technology for doing that would be a grid of LEDs in the back. So the grid of LEDs is probably not as high resolution as the LCDs in the front, and that leads to some funny business with how you change the dynamic range. And so they ended up doing this thing where there's the blurry LED, there is a image displayed on the LCD in the front that has been artificially sharpened to make up for the blurring in the back so that you get the result that you want there. And they actually have a paper in SIGGRAPH describing how they do that. That's a fairly typical technique. I'm not actually that much a fan of these super high resolution displays. They're physically painful to look at, but I can see certain instances in which you might want to use them. One of the reasons these technologies have not caught on that much in the mass market is because the displays themselves have gotten deeper blacks and therefore higher dynamic ranges just in the normal curve of technology. And OLEDs are definitely one of these technologies that have a deep black and therefore good dynamic range naturally, as well as being curved. So this is from Consumer Electronics Show, I think. Oh gosh, this was before the watch came out, but I just love the envisioning of how a curved OLED screen could have been used on the Apple iWatch. Isn't that elegant?
I'm kind of disappointed by reality now.
Excuse me?
I'm kind of disappointed by reality.
I'm disappointed by reality. Yeah. I think this is great. I love the little boot, the home button there. Probably would get pressed quite a bit by accident, so I don't know about that. All right. So let's finally talk about tone mapping. So the idea there is if you do high dynamic range imaging and you do this doubling thing that I have here, you'll end up with more bits in the end. You've got to squeeze it down. So that's one way to look at what the tone mapping has to do. 12 or more bits squeezed into 8 bits for JPEG. And scaling the pixel values is not the right solution, just scaling it back down again. And I'll show you that right now. So here's a high dynamic range example done by bracketing with an SLR, that SLR, or maybe a Canon Mark II. So different exposures. Now we're beginning to bring this in so it's not blown out. But the problem with now this very low exposure is that that's noisy. And so we're going to combine the shadows from one and the highlights from another and produce one high dynamic range image. So that's okay on a fairly modest dynamic range. You can just scale or scale in a simple gamma. But if you try to scale in a simple global tone map, here's what happens on an extreme case. So it's very, very bright up in the cupola there in Valencia. So there are 3 exposures. I still didn't quite capture the stained glass up there, although I think I captured it there. And if I try to merge those using a simple global curve, such as the exposure and gamma method in Photoshop CS4, it produces a poor result. So let's think about so exposure and gamma. So exposure kind of just shifts things. It's like a bias. And you can think of gamma as a gain in a certain space. The midtone's washed out. That's the problem with these global curves, is the midtones tend to wash out on very high dynamic range scenes. So let's take a step back. How do artists solve this problem? Artists have been solving this high dynamic range tone mapping problem for 500 years. They have very low dynamic range media. The difference between their darkest black and their cadmium white is maybe 50 to 1 in reflectance. It's very low dynamic range. But they can do a great job of showing you what seems very obvious to you as a super bright scene. So I showed this image before. That's Charles Sheeler, the upper deck. There's no question when you look at this thing, it looks dazzlingly bright. Or this scene looks dark. There's no question to you that it's candlelit or something like candles. Well, 1765 better be candles. So how do the artists do that? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Why does this seem so bright as a scene? And why does this seem so dark? What do the artists do? Yeah? Sorry?
Predominantly high key or low key.
High key and low key. Exactly what do you mean by that?
Most of the tones in the bright picture are very light, and then you use dark shadows, extreme shadows to show darkness, and then the contrast used in the dark in the candlelit scene. You make most of it black and really.
Okay. So it's not that that these are actually brighter, because that color is probably the same as that color there, except that this one's more yellow. But what you're saying is that the darks are darker here.
I'm saying that all the light tones are clustered,
Right.
and then there's a big bipolar distribution, so that there's a narrow bit of dark.
Right. So all the tones are kind of clustered up near the top here, whereas here there's a very wide dynamic range. So that's basically right. And so Hermann Helmholtz, who is a psychophysicist in the 19th century, wrote great essays on sound, also wrote this essay called The Relation of Optics to Painting, which I heartily recommend. It's a very readable and very intelligent essay. And he says basically, for bright scenes, human vision is dazzled, which compresses brightnesses up near the top, as you said. And for dark scenes, the shadows are below threshold, so they're completely black. So it might be best to draw that on a curve that has this gamma in it. And what he's saying is that for very, very bright scenes, meaning out here in terms of input brightness, that the human visual system just kind of flattens out at some point. And we can barely distinguish the tones from one another. Everything looks bright. And so if you have a scene where most things are this bright, remember the difference between shadowed and sunlit outdoor objects is only 2 f-stops. So it's all fairly bright. It's going to be in this range here that's almost flat. And that's exactly what, that's exactly what Charles Sheeler did here. Here's his photograph, by the way. And here's his painting. And the painting, I think, is much more effective at showing just how dazzling it is up on that upper deck. And then down here, you get pretty dark, and you fall below threshold, and the response is 0. So here's response over here. And here's the luminance of the scene. And so this curve is what Right of Derby is showing here in the orrery. He's taken the shadows and dropped it to black, and that's immediately a cue to us, oh, it must be very dark there. And so painters have known this for centuries. Ought to be pretty straightforward for us to do that digitally. So here's a photograph that I showed before that Fredo Durand took at ISO 25000. He said it was too dark to read the menu. So if I just used a gain and bias, or a gamma and exposure on that, that doesn't do it. But if I did this, now that's beginning to look right. It's beginning to look like it's really dark there. I've dropped the shadows down into the murk. And so this kind of captures it. You can still only use that on a scene of moderate dynamic range. If you have extreme high dynamic range, even this isn't enough. And so here's a great set of slides that I've stolen from Fredo Durand on very, very high dynamic range and different methods for tone mapping that. So here's a scene that's 100,000 to 1. Remember how bright the sun is. The sun's here, although it's a little bit low. It's at sunset. And eventually we have to get down to maybe 8 to 1, 255 to 1 for JPEG. How can we compress the scene's dynamic range? All right, so the sun's blown out, yeah. So if we scale it linearly, that obviously wouldn't work. Almost every pixel would be black except for a little disk of the sun. So we know that's not going to work. We could include a bit more gamma in it. So if we do a gamma compression, in addition to the JPEG compression, so 0.5 here, that helps a little bit, but it kind of washes out the colors. So gamma is just not a good way to do this. And you can, in addition to the raw to JPEG conversion, and you can see that yourself if you look at a particular RGB triplet. So 1.4, 0.2, there's this orange, and you raise that to the 0.5 power, which is what this whole gamma transform did, and it becomes this color. So it washes out. Another way to think about that is, if we look in XY space, remember the chromaticity diagram, we've got our triangle, we've got the spectral locus, the line of extra spectral purples. Applying a gamma transform will take all colors and move them inward toward the neutral point. Just remember that's 1/3, 1/3 in X and Y. So that's the desaturation that will happen if you just raise them to a gamma. Okay, so that's not a good solution. Here's a better solution. So what we're doing here is reducing the contrast of low frequencies, but not of high frequencies. And so that can be done just by doing a Gaussian blur. There's the low frequencies. Subtracting that from the original, there's the high frequencies, and reduce the contrast there. Apply a gamma or something else to that. And then recombine them with the chrominance. The problem there is the halos. See the halos there? Halos. And you can see that right here. So that's not a good solution. All right, here's one that does work. So I'll explain bilateral filtering in a little bit more detail in a few minutes when we talk about denoising. But just for now, think of bilateral filtering as some way to blur without blurring across edges. And so the large scale stuff blurs all that but did not blur across the edges. Subtract that from the original and you'll get something that doesn't have halos. Now if you reduce the contrast of that and then add this back in and add the chrominance back in, it's a much better result. There are no halos. So now suddenly we're no longer doing a global transform. We're doing something that's a lot, in both the last and this example, we're doing now a local tone mapping. And so it is effectively sacrificing global contrast but preserving local contrast. There's strong evidence that that is a good thing to do for the human visual system as a general strategy. Sacrificing global contrast, preserving local contrast. And there are lots of optical illusions that support that hypothesis. And here's one of them. So if I told you that square A is the same brightness as square B, would you believe me?
I've seen it before.
Only because you've seen it before. It just seems impossible to believe. See? Go back. They're obviously the same brightness. We're sensitive to local contrast. We're not as sensitive to global contrast. And so that's the basis for tone mapping using something like a bilateral filter that's decomposing it into different frequency bands. So this was first proposed by Fredo and his student. And so here's an example. So this actually doesn't look all that great. Here's the original. It's very high dynamic range. This looks kind of okay, but it looks a little cartoony, doesn't it? So let's think about this cartooniness now. This is what's called the Mach band illusion. These are step functions, but I assume that for all of you, they don't look like steps. It looks like it's brighter at the right side and darker at the left side of each one of the strips. And so the reason for that is lateral inhibition in the retina, where A bright response at one retinal cell will inhibit the stuff to the left and right of it. It's like a negative coefficient in a convolution. It's like a sharpening function. And so it will turn the step wedge into something that looks like this. Right. The way to think about that as a tool for tone mapping is, suppose you have a step function like this over, so here's brightness, intensity. You have something like this, and this goes from 0 to 512, let's say, or 0 to 1024. You've got to decrease its height in order to squeeze it into 8 bits. So you don't want to just do this, because that will produce those washed out images that I showed before, like the cupola in the cathedral in Valencia. So instead what you do is, maybe I'll draw it on a separate graph. Instead what you do is you apply something like that operator See? So I've decreased the total range. Now no longer goes from 0 to 1023. It goes from 0 to 255. But the height of each of these is still equal to that, just like the human visual system does. So I've preserved local contrast. I've sacrificed global contrast. So just because the human visual system does that, does that mean that that's something we ought to do to images? It's probably possible to push that too far. And that's what kind of leads to the cartooniness in the image I just showed. A classic example from art is Seurat's Lagrangeat, where he had read about these theories of lateral inhibition that were then popular by Hermann von Helmholtz and others in the late 19th century. And so the post-impressionists took that to heart and tried to do the scientifically correct thing. And if you look closely, you'll see he's doing exactly that. He makes it a little lighter just before the dark edge. He also will try to make the colors a little bit complementary just before the contrasting color. Whatever you may think of it as art, I don't think he is being successful in applying the scientific theory. So you have to do this very, very carefully, or you can create these halos, you can create all kinds of bad artifacts. It works to a certain extent, it doesn't work entirely. So here's one of these severe examples. So this is now done digitally. So here are different exposures. And so one common technique, this is photomatics now, using exposure fusion, where exposure fusion will take, it's basically a weighted sum of the original images. They don't even compute an intermediate HDR image. They just take weighted sums of the different exposures, downweighting noisy and saturated pixels, and doing a multi-band blending, which is like the bilateral filter. In other words, take high frequencies from, blend separately the high frequencies and the low frequencies. So that is what is done in HDR+. And here's an example from HDR+. This is on the Nexus 5. There's what a single shot looks like. And there's an exposure fusion multi-band blend that did a pretty good job here. I don't see halos. There's a little bit of stuff going on there, but you could pass it off as fog. Looks pretty good. In particular, there are no halos around the people, and that's pretty important. I could push this far enough that it would produce halos. HDR+ won't allow me to do that, but if we turned off the safety valves inside HDR+, it would produce halos too, if we push the dynamic range very, very far. And you could do that if you wanted to. It'd be a look, a certain look. And so when I first started teaching this course, and I said, so this is what you want to avoid. Immediately all the students in the class started saying, oh, no, show us more pictures like that. Okay, I will bite my tongue next time. And so over the years, it's actually become very popular, and indeed has begun to affect the aesthetic of tone mapping of commercial cell phones, to be honest. I think the Samsung cell phone does a lot more like this than it does a natural appearance like HDR+. Maybe it's a regional thing, maybe it's a taste thing, maybe it's a passing fad. We'll be able to recognize cell phones from the 2010s because of the Trey Ratcliffe stuck at customs look. He pushes it a lot. He's also a good photographer, so he gets very nice images out of it. Okay, so high dynamic range, global methods, local methods, preserving local contrast, bilateral filtering. So I still haven't explained how bilateral filtering works, except that I said it's an edge preserving blur. I'll show it next when we talk about denoising. Any questions about the dynamic range, dynamic range tone mapping? This is a huge topic. There are entire books on HDR tone mapping. Let's see what we're doing here. Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Remind me, what is the visual system doing to deal with this high dynamic range? Because you were saying it's not that we're actually simultaneously seeing that many stops. Like, we can change our eyes over time to look at brighter scenes and darker scenes. But when we are in a dark scene that has bright elements, are we essentially doing something like this, or is it just that different parts of the?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, what does the human visual system do when it looks at a high dynamic range scene? So Greg Ward Larson has this great little physical demo that he used to walk around with, where he had a little slide viewer into which he puts several copies of the same slide glued together very carefully, so that the dense part becomes denser and the clear part stays clear. So that's effectively a high dynamic range slide. And he'll put it in. He'll put a really bright light in the back of it, and then you hold it up and you look at it. It's a stereo pair. And it's a scene in a bedroom. There's a window out there. You're looking at the bed, looks very nice, and you know that it's going to be super bright. You know it's actually going to hurt your eyes to look over the window. You kind of screw up your courage, and you look over at the window. What happens? Your pupils dilate. Your pigment begins to bleach. Your retinal cells fatigue. All of those are true. I had a slide earlier in the course where I enumerated each of those things and gave the particular dynamic range of each of those steps. So that's how we deal with it.
You're really not trying to take them both.
You're not looking at them all at the same time. You can't. Okay. So let's keep going down the camera pipeline. Let's talk about denoising and sharpening. So I've shown this slide before. There's my Canon 5D Mark II at sunset and some noisy images. So here's what the raw image looks like. If I just do a Gaussian blur, so a Gaussian function with a standard deviation of 1.3, I'll get this. But it blurs out the edges. If I look at the JPEG image that comes with that from Canon, it does a better job than that. It preserves the edges. I don't know what Canon does. It's proprietary, but I do know something that works. And I'll show you in a moment that it looks very, very similar to what Canon did. And that is bilateral filtering. Okay? So the theory behind bilateral filtering is that that scenes are composed of piecewise piecewise images with noise added. So there's something of one intensity and there's some variation, and then it'll switch to a different color or a different texture or a different object or a different illumination condition, and it will have some noise too. But if we think of images as piecewise with noise added, what we'd really like to do is blur just within that one image. Because if we blur uniformly, so that's a convolution by a kernel, we'll blur across the edge. Sad. So what we want to do is blur just within each region. And so the way to think about that is, for that pixel, we'd like to blur, but we don't only like to blur among pixels that have roughly the same intensity, under this model that the world is composed of piecewise patches. Okay? So for that particular pixel, then the convolution kernel ought to look like this, cropped off where the edge is, where the weight's therefore 0 outside of that. If we convolve by that kernel, we get this. Now that kernel will therefore need to change for every input pixel. This clipping line has to move around relative to the kernel. So the weights fall off with increasing distance from the pixel being blurred. You can see that here. But it also falls off with increasing intensity difference. So in this case, I just have two intensities. So there's a fall off completely to zero. But if the intensities were a little bit closer, there would be some positive weight in the part on the right side of the edge there. So one way to think about that is we're blurring in both the domain and the range, where domain is x and y and the range is the intensity. It's a good way to think about it. Here's the formula. It's a pretty simple formula. Some normalization, and there's the convolution where p minus q is how far apart is the center pixel and the pixels that you might be adding to it. And it will fall off as you get further and further away by some distance or some norm. And the intensity of the pixel, and so the contribution it makes will fall off as it gets to be a different intensity from the center pixel. That's another way of saying exactly the same thing. So it will fall off with space and it will fall off with the range. And so most denoisers operate that way. That's the way Noise Ninja works. I've shown this picture before. And it looks like that perhaps that's the way that Canon does it, because if I apply a bilateral filter, I get something very similar to what Canon does. So I suspect they're doing some kind of bilateral filtering. And so that preserves across edges, because it will only blur stuff if it's roughly the same intensity. And so it's a great denoiser. Can easily be extended to RGB. You can do it separately in different channels. Can be applied more or less to chrominance than luminance. And so you can preserve your edges even better. You can combine it with demosaicing, so you could even do it just before you did the interpolation for demosaicing, because it preserves edges nicely, and you need those edges to not interpolate across the edges when you're demosaicing. It's a very active area of research. Any questions? No. I should first ask, are there any questions on the bilateral filter? I've gone over this very, very fast. This is just the idea of bilateral filtering. There are fast ways to implement that I'm not talking about, fast algorithms. Okay. Sharpening. So there's a slightly more complicated story on sharpening, just like there is on denoising. So if we just apply ordinary sharpening, like the convolution applet that is linked into the course, that's what that looks like. And even on this low-res monitor, you can see the effect. I can do stronger. So I've changed the weights. It's even stronger sharpening. It looks kind of gross, doesn't it? Yeah. Too crisp. Doesn't seem to be sharpening the right things. So we can reduce that effect a little bit by blending in. So here's only 30% of a sharp image plus the original, where the blend is done in Photoshop. Now it doesn't seem to be sharpening quite enough. There, by the way, is just the effect of the sharpening, and I can do that just by changing the weights. So what I end up with is a gray image where any pixels that would have gotten brighter because of the sharpening are lighter than gray, and any that would have been darkened are darker than gray. So you can kind of see what the diff image looks like. Here's something better, in the same sense that bilateral filtering is better than just a Gaussian blur. It's called unsharp masking, and here's how it works. And I'll use this great illustration from Cambridge in Color, which, by the way, is a really great website on this kind of stuff. So start with the original, and so there's a plot of just the vertical stroke in the T in text. Blur it, so you can see now that that plot looks kind of soft. Subtract the two, and you end up just with this stuff that goes on at the edges. Now that stuff should actually go below as well. There should be both positive and negative excursions, but you absolute it and threshold it. Wait, do I have that reversed? No, I think I have it right. Yeah, it's absolute and then threshold. Okay, so you get these two little humps where there are edges here. All right. Now you take the original and you increase its contrast. This is actually based on an analog technique. You can do this in the darkroom. And that's where the word unsharp masking came from. And then you do a blend. You do a blend between the contrasty and the original using this mask. And so what you end up with is the original with slight excursions there and slight excursions there. Here's a reasonable formula. Original plus the contrasty, which is that one, times the mask, which is this. That's unsharp masking. So the fact that we're using thresholding avoids sharpening the noise. And so that's one way in which it differs from just an ordinary sharpening convolution. It's that thresholding. That and the absolute value make the filter nonlinear. So this is not just a convolution. You cannot replace this with an equivalent convolution. You have to go through these steps. So here it is applied. So this is just ordinary sharpening, and here's the unsharp mask. So the unsharp mask, look at her eyes. They look pretty good. Here's the original. So it's definitely sharper than the original, but not as kind of gross and sharpening of features you don't want to sharpen as a sharpening filter. So it's a very nice filter. All right, so bilateral filtering reduces noise while preserving edges. Unsharp masking sharpens edges but does not sharpen noise. Both are non-linear. Questions? Any burning questions? Quiet on the dory. Florian.
So the original lab technique is just the original lab technique for unsharp masking is just a convolution. There's no thresholding in it for the absolute.
Florian says that the original laboratory, the wet lab technique for doing unsharp masking is just a convolution.
Yeah, you make a slightly blurred negative of the original image.
Slightly blurred negative of the original. So you don't, it would seem like there's, in the printing, there's effectively a thresholding going on.
Well, there's zero, but
There's
Right.
chemical effects that
Chemical effects that make it nonlinear.
you get depletion effects of the thing. I don't know a whole lot about this, but I've been told that the reason it works is that the depletion effect in the developing process
Depletion effect. Let's take this offline.
basically does.
Right. Let's take that offline.
The simple answer though is sometimes you use graphic arts film to do this, and that's a high contrast film.
High contrast film.
Threshold.
And so that's effectively thresholding. Yeah. I think there is a nonlinear effect, but let's take this offline. And if appropriate, I'll add a sticky to the lecture notes later. Okay. Finally, let's talk about compression. So JPEG files are kind of the standard for photography, and we'll only talk about those. That's what it stands for. Defines a codec and the file format. The file format's actually called this, but people just use JPEG. Good for compressing images of natural scenes. It's not so good for compressing graphics. There are other techniques that are better for that. It is lossy, and so you lose quality each time you open it. I probably don't need to tell that to this audience, but if you're going to edit your photograph in multiple stages, don't use JPEG. Start from the raw so that you don't end up with a compression on top of compression, especially if you're rotating the image or cropping it, and the crop might not be on 8-pixel boundaries. We'll see why 8's important in just a second. You'll get pretty bad artifacts pretty quickly. So here's some lossless compression techniques. So inside the JPEG file is this stuff called EXIF data. So it was actually a file format, but everyone still just calls it JPEG, and there's EXIF stuff in there. And what's important for us is what is in the EXIF. So the EXIF tells us information about the shot. It's metadata. So if I just use, here's an old version of Photoshop, and it says, for example, what is the color space? That's important. So let's see, it's a JPEG file. The JPEG file is actually Y prime CB and CR. Remember I talked about that? This is the gamma transformed luminance and 2 chrominance signals. There's a simple 3x3 matrix that will go back from that to RGB. I showed that matrix before. Now the question is, what does that RGB mean? That RGB needs to be in a color space. And so here is the color space that RGB is in. So that's what this EXIF means. It's in the sRGB. So what is sRGB? It's a particular set of 3 primaries and a particular white point. And those primaries are specified with X, Y, Z coordinates. You remember that, the whole color lecture thing? All right. So what else is in the EXIF? Well, here's EXIF tool, which will dump a lot more for you. Tells you, for example, the focal length of the lens, 105 millimeters. It tells you the focus distance was probably between that range. Interestingly, that's not in EXIF because Canon is probably violating some of Nikon's patents, and so they don't put it in the EXIF, but it's actually hidden in the RAW, and the guy who wrote EXIF tool has figured it out. So that's why EXIF tool shows it. All kinds of stuff going on here. Here's something else that's in EXIF data, and that's the location. I can just get it with Mac Preview. So where is this? What country is it in? Yeah, it's Toronto. Kind of obvious. All right. So compare that to RAW files. So RAW files are minimally processed, not even demosaiced. So a RAW file, if you could look at it directly, is a grayscale image with this grid. I've shown you this before. Behind each of the red, green, and blue pixels. It's uncompressed or losslessly compressed. It includes metadata, possibly hidden in the RAW, like I just said. And there are a number of different RAW formats. There's no universal standard for that. It is processed and converted to a JPEG file, and now you have a variety of options. You can use proprietary software. You can use Photoshop or Lightroom if they support your camera. You can use freeware programs. It gets done by your camera if it spits out a JPEG, but their processing algorithms are all different. And that's the high order bit on this slide, that everyone's using a different processing algorithm. So if you use Lightroom or Photoshop, you will not get the same picture that you get inside the Canon camera, for example. And so here is Canon Digital Professional, or Canon Digital Photo Professional, and it might have a variety of controls in its converter from RAW to JPEG. It might, for example, allow you to, let's see, which one's that? Oh, distortion correction. So it has to know the lens, and it has to know the focus setting for the zoom and the zoom setting for the lens in order to do that pincushion or barrel distortion correction. This is, what does it say? Peripheral illumination, so that's vignetting. And if you look at the corners, you'll see they can get a little bit brighter. So it's correcting for vignetting. And then finally, chromatic aberration, and at least at this scale, I don't see anything happening here. So this has to know the lens. Now finally, let's talk about the compression, the lossy compression itself to JPEG. So here is the compression, here's the decompression pipeline. So it starts from Y prime CVCR. So that has the gamma transform already done. It also typically has the 2 chrominance signals downsized by 2x in each of x and y. So as I said during the color lecture, so it's 4 y values, 1 CB, and 1 CR for a 2x2 block. And then each component is compressed separately. Now let's talk about the compression of each component separately. So the way JPEG works is it splits the image into 8x8 blocks. So, and then quantizes it to 8 bits. So there's an 8-bit quantization. Converts it to 0-centered, so just bias. And then it applies a Fourier transform. So in particular, it's a discrete cosine transform using these basis functions. So it's computing just by applying this formula, it's converting it to weightings for cosinusoids. So it's like a Fourier transform, which I haven't really gone through in detail in this course, except that because the image is the input is real, not complex, you only need half the output. There are a variety of ways to do that. One of them is to use cosines only instead of cosines and sines. I'm not going to go through all the identities that make that possible. So here are a bunch of cosine basis functions. This one is all white. That's the so-called DC term. And then these have increasing spatial frequency horizontally, increasing spatial frequency vertically, increasing spatial frequency in both directions. So here's one of them. So you can think of that. You can think of that function, that basis function, as just being. See, it starts from. So that's all that basis function is. It's a cosine. It's a single cosinusoid. The fact that it is negative in its weighting simply means that the amount of that cosinusoid that should be added is a slightly down-weighted negative cosinusoid. So that's what the negative 61 means. If it were negative 255, it would be full amplitude negative. And so here is that transform. This is lossless so far. All we've done is we've converted it to another space. This is reversible. We could go back and forth with no loss. Okay, but we now have this discrete cosine transform of that 8 by 8 block. The next step is to observe that the human visual system is more sensitive to low and mid frequencies than very high frequencies. So we can quantize the latter coarsely. And so we quantize them. And so a lot of them got knocked to 0. Here is a quantization table that effectively says how big should the bin be for each of these coefficients. And the bins are smaller, meaning a finer quantization for the low frequencies than the very, very highest frequencies. That's what that means here. Low frequencies are up here, high frequencies are down here. And so if we take that one particular bin we were looking at before, whose discrete cosine transform was negative 61, that says there should be a bin size of 10. So there'll be, I guess, 25 of them in the range 255, or 50 of them in the full positive negative range. So there'll only be a discrete number of possible values and some positive values as well. And it can't be anything other than that. And so it is the negative 6th bin. So small values here, because the bin size was large, just go to 0. So that then, of course, is lossy. And that's where the compression comes from. And then finally, we arrange those non-zero coefficients in a zigzag order so that the low frequency stuff is in the upper left. There it is. And now these long runs will tend to be 0. And so we can use run length encoding to remove those repeated zeros. And then we finally apply an arithmetic code of some kind, like a Huffman code. And what that means is that it will use shorter bit strings to represent more common inputs, and longer bit strings to represent less common inputs. And that is a standard. I won't go into the details of Huffman coding. It's probably on your interview questions. And so that's lossless too. But it is an efficient coding of something like this. All right, so there are, if I use, I think it's libjpeg has the quality values going from 1 to 100 and might produce these amounts of compression, 144 to 1. And at least from where you're sitting looking at this projector, you probably can't see very much degradation. Certainly not in the 23 to 1. This is not easily comparable to Photoshop or other encoders. They use their own variants of these methods. In particular, the quantization tables that I showed are proprietary. Yeah, especially if it's displayed small enough. Okay, so raw files, direct output, 16 bits losslessly compressed, JPEG or standard, 8 bits lossy, contain the EXIF data, and then here's the discrete cosine transform. Questions? Yeah.
In those JPEG quantization tables, why do the numbers tend to be different if you move in the X direction versus the Y direction?
That's a very good question. Again, remember, they are proprietary. Different people might do different things. I think it would be some notion of how sensitive the human visual system is to horizontal versus vertical frequencies. Zolman, is that roughly right?
Yeah, but also the first question I'd ask is what's the subsampling? Right, the subsampling doesn't have to be the same in X and Y. That's the first thing I'd check. But
The subsampling not the same in X and Y. Okay.
the color subsampling?
Well, it's usually just by 2x in each of X and Y for CB and CR.
Okay.
So I don't think that's it. I think it's a decision that was made of preserving horizontal versus vertical frequencies. And that's why these things are proprietary.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my best guess there. Florian?
So this looks like it might be the table that was published along with the JPEG standard, and there doesn't seem to be a clear record of where that table
So Florian is actually recognizing the particular table that I had here.
It might be. So,
Wait, where'd that table go?
Right, I mean, you're going to run into issues of portrait versus landscape if you start making decisions about vertical and horizontal, right?
Right, so you better have a good accelerometer so you know what is horizontal and what's vertical.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that would go into that if you were going to try to make that kind of optimization.
Right.
This is why I'm
Okay, I will look that up and I'll add a sticky if there's something different than the answer that I just gave. Okay, so that's it on the post-processing pipeline. I know I went through this way too fast. There's a lot more detail that one could go into. So we have one more lecture. It'll be panoramas and history lecture. And that'll be next Wednesday.